Hi, everybody. Welcome to Vision 360, where we look at cybersecurity from every angle, starting with the foundation, extending through corporate governance and beyond. I am your host, Matthew Webster, and I focus on solving cybersecurity governance by helping organizations align security with business strategy. That means emphasizing governance, resilience, communication, emotional intelligence, and practical risk management. My approach is shaped by decades of experience in the field, including several chief information security officer roles. I've worked with leadership teams through training, workshops, assessments, and direct advisory support, always with the goal of making cybersecurity a strategic asset and not a technical afterthought. Today, I'm joined by Jeffrey Wheatman, a well-known cybersecurity risk strategist, thought leader, and advocate for bridging the gap between technical and cybersecurity and business risk. Jeffrey helps organizations better understand, communicate, and manage cyber risk in business terms. So there is no way that I can do justice to you, Jeffrey, by introducing you the way you deserve. Maybe you could say a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so thanks, Matthew. It's a pleasure. You and I have known each other for probably a year and a half now. I think we did a
Something like that.
panel together and we kind of hit it off. And you were on my podcast a while ago, and I'm really, really excited to be here. So I've actually given a lot of thought to sort of what I am and who I am. And I sort of sum it up in three words. I'm a connector. I bring people together. I know a lot of people in the industry who don't know each other and should. And actually, you and I talked about a couple people I'm going to introduce you to later on today that you should know. I'm a communicator, and I think that dovetails really nicely into what you talk about. I have spent a lot of time in my career realizing that I can sit down at a table with two people that don't know the same thing and actually get them moving in the same direction. I thought everybody could do that, but it turns out it's a somewhat unique skill. And then I'm a strategist. You talk, all the stuff you said in your intro really resonates with me. We serve a function to help accomplish business goals, right? Money coming in, money going out, and how do we manage the risk that we face? And those are really the three things. So currently I have a strategist sort of evangelist role at Black Kite. Been doing that for 3.5 years, and we'll talk a little bit about what we do, I think, as part of our conversation. I spent 15 years as a Gartner analyst where I had the unique perspective. So I run programs, I built programs. I'm now on the vendor side. As an analyst, I had the outside in view. So I would hear from both sides about why doesn't the other side listen? And then before that, I was in consulting. I built some consulting practices. Early in my career as a pen tester, I was not a great technical pen tester, but I was a great social engineer, which essentially is what I do now, right? And I was a network guy. I was in retail back early in my career. Born and raised New Yorker, but at this point in my career, which has given me a life beyond my wildest dreams, I want to give back. So I love having conversations like this with people like you, because I feel you and I are aligned with we want to make the world safer. And I know that sounds altruistic, but it is really in my heart of hearts what I want to do.
Well, I think it makes everybody happier. So I love the fact that you and I share that in common. But
Yep.
thank you so much.
Yeah, no, my
So
pleasure.
today's discussion I'm very excited about. It's one that I'm very passionate about. So today the discussion is going to be around key performance indicators, KPIs, if you're not familiar with it. So these are indicators that there are problems or challenges and things like that. And that's what we're going to explore today. We're going to look into how are they used, what are the right KPIs for the right context, and so on. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into some of the questions we have here today. So
Absolutely.
let's start with a basic overview of key performance indicators. So what do you see as the key types of performance indicators and where should they be used? For example, do you look at operational? Do you look at risk? Do you look at cybersecurity? Do you tie those into business terms? What are the basic types of KPIs that you look at or you're concerned with?
Well, let's start with something very simple, right? Let's deconstruct what that term is, right? Key, important, performance. How well are we doing the things that we say we're going to do? And indicators, right? Are we hitting the targets? Are we falling short? And what does that mean for us from a business perspective? I think people throw these terms around. You mentioned it, and we talk about it a lot. We throw these terms around. I think there's an abstraction sometimes. So I think from the perspective of our conversation, I think we need to distill down all of the technical things that we do in cyber to some really important high level things that resonate with our business stakeholders, right? I talk about it all the time. Money coming in, money going out, and if something goes bad, who gets in trouble, right? Really simple, dramatic oversimplification, but I think it's a really core sort of way to look at these things. I think from sort of the operational and the risk and the cybersecurity perspective, I think we need to start with some really simple concepts, right? Go to your company's annual report. Go to your company's website and look for a mission, a vision, and values, and think about how we can identify exposures and risks. And risk, as we talk about all the time, goes way broader than just cyber, which is where we have come from initially, but focusing on those things and helping understand. So come up with a list of things we do that have an impact on that, identify how well we're delivering on them now. So I'll give you a tactical example just to start. We patch our systems, right? We currently patch them in 90 days. And you go, well, is that good enough? And probably it's not. So what's a reasonable target? I think we can go from 90 to 45. Okay. So then we start measuring how well we're getting those patches out. And then we start to tweak that a little bit and say, okay, so not all patches are the same. Some of them are on critical business systems that if they got owned or went down, we would be much more exposed. So now let's look at, well, do we want to patch those systems faster? And if we continue down that road, what we end up with is we hit our targets 95% of the time. That is a key performance indicator that is linked back to a business objective, rather than we patch in 37 days, because that doesn't mean anything. Or rather than we have 1 million open vulnerabilities. You got 1 million open vulnerabilities? How many servers do you have? 1 million? You're doing really well. 2, you're not doing so well. So we need to build this context. And, there are a lot of concepts out there that I leverage, but don't necessarily use, like balanced scorecards. Using what's the strategy roadmaps that those guys came up with sort of as a secondary thing. My former colleagues over at Gartner have outcome-driven metrics. And, we see all of these things. But I think at the end of the day, we have to build a story first. It's the old tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them, with a little bit of a twist. Tell them why you're going to tell them why you told them. And then that gives your executives the ability to defend the decisions, right? One of the things you and I talked about before we hit the record button was CISOs getting blamed for decisions being made by other people. That is a huge problem. And to me, KPIs, and then we'll probably talk about KRIs as well. KPIs are the way we can build that sort of conceptually. And then I'll just share one last thing that I've been talking about a lot lately, which is the concept of value chains. So value chains are an economic concept built by Michael Porter. Everyone knows Michael Porter for his forces in marketing. But what Michael Porter figured out was, we sell a pencil for way more than the raw material of the pencil's value. Well, how does that happen? And he built these value chains, and he said, we do these things, we combine them, we add our intellectual sort of prowess, our knowledge, and throughout that, there's value added at each sort of juncture. Well, there are risks at each juncture as well. So we need to start to build those and say, we do this thing called threat and vulnerability management. What does that enable us to do? It enables us to keep our systems up and running. It enables them to be stable. It enables us to have some base level of protection against bad actors. If we don't do those things, the systems go down, the process breaks, you can't make money, ka-ching, we have a business problem, right? So I know that was a very long sort of answer, but it's a complicated, it's a simple thing that is very hard to do.
Right. And trying to present that information too, because I think that's one of the challenges a lot of CISOs have is you've got this concept, but how does it relate to the business? Like you talked a little bit about the storytelling. The storytelling to me is absolutely critical if you're going to be communicating with executives. If they don't understand the why, they understand the what, but you don't understand the why, that's important. Right. They're never going to be able to communicate it. You can't communicate that with the board. And I think one of the things that everybody, because one of the things I do is I explore a lot of different professions. I jump into internal audit a little bit. I jump into the risk world. I jump into the cybersecurity world. And it's a very common thing, and I'm guilty of doing this from time to time myself, is we stay in our own little bubbles. And so we think that we understand it. Well, it's not patched. Well, what does that mean? And that's something a lot of people have a hard time communicating. So if you were to help CISOs, get that storytelling, could you give me an example of something where you're starting to build and where you think that would be very helpful for them to build a story around that and why that's actually important? Because you talked a little bit about the critical objectives of the business and trying to analyze that. That's fantastic. I'm all for doing that. I think that's one of the things that a lot of CISOs miss. We're doing it, it becomes security for security's sake and not security for the sake of the business, even though the intent is often for the intent for the business, but where there's a missing connector for a lot of people. So maybe if you could help out here.
Yeah, so I'll give you a real example of something that we have seen within the third party sort of vendor supply chain ecosystem. So there was, and was is a key word here, there was a logistics company in the UK called KNP Logistics. They were also known as Knights of the Old. They were a 156-year-old shipping and logistics company. 2 years ago, they got hit with ransomware. In 45 days, they were in receivership, and in 90 days, out of business. And you go, well, that sucks, right? But it really sucks for people that were waiting for a truck to show up with raw material. It really sucks for people who were waiting for a truck to show up to pick product to ship to a store or a distribution facility. And the reason why I think that's a great story is nobody was looking at the cybersecurity posture of KNP Logistics. Why would we care about their cyber posture? Well, we now have an answer. They got hit with ransomware. That had a critical cascading impact on people's business. And what's interesting is it happened 2 years ago. It's recently come back into the news quite a bit. A friend of mine, Keon Williams, actually interviewed the CEO or former CEO from KNP, and he's got a paper that I won't ruin, but it's an interesting story because they had a pretty good program. And I'll sort of leave it to people to dig a little bit in there. But I shared that story at our customer advisory board, and one of my customers put her hand up and said, yeah, that cost us $5.5 million, right?
Sure.
So that's a story that we can tell very easy and simply. And then we want to say, okay, so what do we do with that story? Well, we probably should be looking at our critical logistics partners, physical or digital, and take a look at what they're doing from a cyber posture. Here are the 3 activities that we do, and here's how well we do them. So yeah, now you've taken the story and you've turned that into 2 or 3 key performance indicators or key risk indicators that you can report, and you can call those. And you can always refer back to KNP. And there are tons of examples out there. That I like that one because it hits on a couple of different sort of facets. And I think it tells a powerful story. This was a family business. A bunch of people lost their jobs, people lost money, and it had this cascading impact 2, 3, 4 sort of links down the road. That's just one example.
Sure. And I think that's a really good one. So I had an opportunity. I talked about the Maersk breach to a bunch of people in logistics. That really resonated in terms of the why.
Right.
And it's something that I think was such a powerful influence on them, because that was something where same thing as what you're describing, a lot of people lost their things. It was, I can't remember the numbers, but let's call it $3 billion hit against the company. It was massive. Their company was completely 100% down. That was within 2 hours. It was something like 55,000 machines were compromised in 7 minutes. Things like that are stories, and they do have a way of really impacting others. And I think those are some of the things that CISOs really need to focus on when working with those KPIs.
Obviously a ton of discussion around AI comes up everywhere now, right? I think
Yes.
we actually got like 12 minutes in without talking about AI. I think it's like a record. But what's happening in a lot of these cases, right? You talked about Maersk being down in 2 hours. The bad actors, they're not using AI to do anything new, really. They're doing the same old stuff they've been doing, but they're so much faster now. They're able to find open vulnerabilities and create malware in seconds and minutes. It used to take hours and weeks. So to your point, the acceleration, right? Everybody talks about likelihood times impact equals risk, and that it is what it is. And I think you and I can have we could spend an hour just talking about whether that works. But the one that people don't look at is a concept out of ERM, which is velocity. When it happens, how fast does it go?
Sure.
And some of these things go really fast. Some of them go slow. The ones that go fast, we need to figure out what those are. And I think that needs to be built into our risk calculus and our risk communication with the integration. We saw, I don't know when this episode's going to go up, but there were fairly recent incidents at 2 major technology providers, both of which were related to DNS. And I won't name names because I don't like to do that. But That thing happened in minutes. And here's an interesting thing. My daughter lives in an apartment building in Philadelphia. They use a digital system. That digital system sat on the infrastructure from one of these cloud service providers. The people in the building couldn't get into their apartments. Who thinks about those things?
Yep.
Nobody.
Depends, because to me, that's one of the things I'm all about, telling stories and then learning
Right.
about these big issues that are going on out there, because they are case studies and they are stories to go say, hey, here's what happened. Let's talk to management about that. So
Right.
let's start to turn those into, because I think there's a lot of great material just in that difference between the initial KPI and trying to come up with a financial calculation. How would you approach something like that? Because I think that story, it's like, it's a story that's out there. It might be extreme, but it is happening more and more regularly all the time now. We're seeing that not just in cybersecurity incidents, but just standard incidents where you've got companies that are interconnected or using particular pieces of software to take down whole infrastructures for at least a period of time. And that's ending up being a big problem. We're seeing lawsuits with that. How do you approach something like that?
It's a tough one. I think what I like to do is I like to get that emotional hook in there. And I think KNP is a good example. My daughter not being able to get into her apartment is a good example. And we have tons and tons of them. Maersk is a good example. And then I like to sort of follow that up with, would that be bad for us? Asking the executives, how bad would it be? And then once we can get them to agree, yes, that would be something we don't want, we can then say, well, here are three initiatives we have. And this is not about patching, right? This is about programmatic things: threat and vulnerability management, identity and access management, governance, risk, and compliance, which is an area where I know you spend a ton of time, communication and awareness, right? And well, we've implemented those, and we'd like to talk to you about how well we're doing them and what our targets are, and then map that to expense. Right. So I used to do a lot of work on risk appetite. And when I was on stage, I would ask the audience a series of questions. How many of you patch your system? And this was all security audience. So how many of you patch your systems in 30 days? And most of the hands would go up. How many of you patch in 7? And a lot of hands would go down. And I would say, okay, why? And the answer is, in your head, you've made a determination. The cost of patching in 7 is significantly higher than the cost of patching in 30. And we don't believe we get enough return on risk management for that. So what'd you do? You did a risk appetite calculation in your head. The problem is you're not having that conversation with your business executives, and it's their risk. This is what we need to start doing. And that's why those KPIs are really, really valuable. You know, we talked about earlier, if I tell you I patch in 30 days, that doesn't mean anything unless you know what my target is. If my target's 90, I'm probably spending too much money. If my target is 7, we're failing. And
Yeah.
that's why it's so important. That's why performance is the word. How well do we do the things we say we're going to do? And that is really, really critical. And then I think we can also look at frameworks like high trust and SOC to a certain degree. And some of the AI frameworks, we actually have a really cool new AI governance framework that we just put out at Black Kite. And all these things have controls in them. So we can use those controls to start to drive KPI and KRI discussions, but we can't fall in love with them because not all of them are applicable. And any good framework will tell you not all of these things are applicable to everybody.
Sure.
But you talked about hanging out with auditors. This is where we need to have better collaboration with the auditors. My experience with auditors is frequently we tell them, okay, so that control isn't relevant to us, and here's why. And then they still say you have to do it. So we gotta be
It
better
always is a
collaboration
balance.
discussion.
It's when you're dealing with auditors, it's a double-edged sword. And it
Yes.
also depends on the type of auditors too. In some organizations, they're going to make up some reason that's not a control, but they're going to say it's confusing. And then you got to write some big, huge, massive document for something that everybody already understands. I've had to deal with that personally myself. But other cases, you can use them as a friend to kind of move the needle where it needs to be
Right.
moved. That's been my personal
Yeah.
experience, that you really have to understand the context, the type of compliance, et cetera. But
Yep.
I think too, you hit on like a really interesting point when it came to the KPIs, because it's that confusion that's sometimes going on up at the executive level and then at the board level. Now, when you jump in for a higher level, like boards typically focus on taking a look at the response. But what I've also encountered recently, there's one company I was talking to where the board is now wanting to see the operational KPIs. So by operational, what's actually going on, what's actually happening from a cybersecurity perspective. To simplify it, how quickly are things being patched, and why does that equal a particular dollar value from a corporate perspective, and how do you start to do those alignments? And those are very interesting, and to me they're very energizing, because most board of directors don't sit down and focus on that kind of operational KPI. They're more taking a look at, hey, what's the financial risk? What's the value at risk, or some of those things. And some CISOs do go in that direction. Other CISOs don't focus on some of those financial concepts. How do you relate to some of those financial concepts when it comes to KPIs?
Yeah, so I think I like the value chain approach that I talked about, because I think we can pretty clearly articulate the business value of a particular business process, right? Sales generates this, order fulfillment generates this, R&D generates this, and I think we can work backwards from there. So my undergraduate degree is in economics. And shockingly, I actually use a lot of the concepts from that in my day-to-day. But the thing that I really learned that I think is very important is when we talk about models, and ultimately these KPIs are built on models, right? The more accurate a model is, the harder it is to use. The easier it is to use, the less accurate and precise it is. And we need to find that balance, right? And there's cyber risk quantification, and using open fair, and using all these other models, and like, we can talk about whether they work or how they're to be used. And frankly, I think they work as long as people understand what they're supposed to do. But I think we need to be able to articulate. We need to think about what questions are the audience is going to ask. Where did you get that from? Why is that 0.5 versus 0.7? Why is that $1 million versus $56, right? So we need to be able to sort of defend those decisions. And here's the challenge for people like you and I and a lot of our colleagues at our career stage. The answer sometimes ends up being, well, I've been doing this a long time, and based on my experience, and you might be right. But what the audience hears is, you're guessing. And about 10 years ago, I had an opportunity to go and talk to the CFO and controller for a large publishing company. They wanted an overview of IT risk with no acronyms and no jargon. It was really fun. It was an exercise in communication for me. And at the end, I said to the CFO, "Can I ask you a question?" And he said, "Yeah, sure." So I said, "So you buy magazines and newspapers?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "How do you decide which ones you buy?" And he said, "Oh, we have a model." And I said, "Well, what happens if the model comes up 50-50?" And he looked at me and thought about it and said, "Well, I go with my gut." I said, "Okay, how come you can do that and we can't?" And without missing a beat, he said, "Because we don't trust you." They don't trust the technology people. Why? Not long enough. We haven't been here long enough. Those financial models are 200 years old in some cases. The technology models are not. We've been forecasting the sky is falling and the wolf is coming to town for 50 years, and it hasn't happened. I think we're starting to see more and more of that global impact. We talked about some real financial impact, but I think ultimately we need to ask the questions of ourselves before we get them from the business. I have a deck I do on sort of like next generation third-party cyber risk management. And my closing slide is, who's going to care? Why are they going to care? What are they going to do? And what do we then do with what they tell us, right? Those 4 questions, you need to ask them of yourselves. Why am I showing this? Don't fall in love with your metrics, your measures, your KPIs, unless you vet them. And I'm a big fan of this question. Does this help you make better decisions?
Yeah, I think when you get into risk management, that's one of the things that's often missing. It gets back to my point on security for security's sake. We think that we're trying to protect the company, and we are as CISOs, but that doesn't always connect properly with executive management. And so, like, the other thing too, when you talked about approaching things, like, one of the things that I find very valuable, because I love that story that you're saying, like, well, how come you can do it, not me? Trust is like the currency of how everything works. When you talk about economics, buying and sell things, it's all about trust. Do you trust the vendor? Do you trust the people that you're working with? People buy from people that they trust. You burn that trust, they're not going to be willing to work with you or purchase from you or anything else. Trust is really the foundation. I mean, there are some obvious exceptions out there. Like, I know TJ Maxx, when they had their breach years ago, it barely affected. People kept going, so it's like a cheap place to go. So it didn't really have any long-term impact. So there are some exceptions to that. There's some outside influence to it, but that trust is very important. I think that's one of the things that CISOs and others need to work on, because you're getting down to a communication problem. Because if I start talking about, well, I noticed that the CVE on that is going to be 8.9 and blah, blah, whoa, what are you talking about? You're going to scare.
Deer in the headlights.
Exactly. And it's like, also it kind of brings in some human factors, because people don't want to look stupid. So let's say if you're a CFO and you hear the CVE score versus, EPSS versus CVSS, you put on a blank face and like, you make it look like, but a lot of people are afraid to ask. You will occasionally get the people like, what on earth are you talking about? But a lot of people don't. How have you played with that in the past? Because you're starting to gear towards that. And I like some of the stories you were telling. I think you're starting to head in that direction. How have you dealt with that particular challenge yourself, or have you seen others or work with others on?
That's a great question. I think there are a couple of things. I think one would be, so I'm going to use some terms that you might not be familiar with. If I say anything you don't recognize, please let me know. There are no bad questions. The only bad questions are the ones you don't ask, right? So then we put them sort of at ease a little bit. The other thing, and I learned this from a former colleague of mine, never ever make anyone feel dumb. Because if you make one person on the board of the executive committee feel dumb, they will band together against you because none of them want to hear that. So, so this is a story, and this is a true story. My friend was in front of a board talking about cloud when cloud was new. And one of the board members said, well, what happens to the data in the cloud when it rains? And without missing a beat, my friend said, that is a great question. Clearly, I did not explain this properly. And then articulated what it was. So she basically said in her head, that's a dumb question, but I'm going to blame myself, right? So taking ownership of the fact that clearly we did not do a good job of communicating that. So I think that's a really, really important thing. I also think that breaking it down into very, very simple things. And if you need to use these terms, you got to explain them and articulate them, right? So CVEE, and I mix them up all the time, so I'll probably get it wrong. But
okay.
One of them is how likely this thing is, and the other is how bad it is. Those things are relevant, and then you can never talk about those terms again, and it's okay. And then the other thing I think that's very, very important is, again, and we keep talking about this, and I know you do it a lot in your workshops and your consulting, is connecting it back to the business goals. That ultimately, if we don't do that, we're going to have a problem. And I always talk about this kind of story. So I see this all the time. CISOs go to the management and go, hey, we got this thing. We need $5 million. And management says, well, what if I don't give you that money? And this person goes, something real bad is going to happen. Oh, how bad? Real bad. When do you think it's going to happen? Pretty soon. And then we wonder why they're not giving us any money. You know why? Because when you go to marketing and marketing says, I need $5 million, what am I going to get for that? $50 million in pipeline. When you go to sales, for $5 million, I'm going to be able to hire 10 salespeople with $1 million in quota, and we're going to close that, and you're going to get $10 million back, right? I always talk about mapping dollars to dollars. We don't do that in cyber unless we're able to bring in some of these risk quant things. And I get none of these models are perfect, but at least we can articulate them, and it gives us a standard approach to the way we are kind of going after these things. I also think we need to simplify. I get people thanking me frequently using this term. Thank you for dumbing that down to me, but that is not what I'm doing. I'm meeting you where you are, where you need to be. You don't need to know what I've learned in 35 years in cybersecurity. You don't need to learn what Matthew Webster's learned in 30 years in cybersecurity, right? You don't need to know that. All you need to know is, what does it mean to you? And that is where we need to get to. And that's where the stories are really important. You give a story about something that happened. And the funny thing, Matthew, and I'll admit this in public, I tell stories. I don't even know some of them are true anymore because I've been telling them for so long. You know, human memory is very interesting. But if they articulate a point, it doesn't matter. right? And I think that's a really critical thing. I did a presentation on storytelling. I updated it, and I'm using four parables from Hans Christian Andersen,
Sure.
right? And I got crazy good feedback when I delivered that to a bunch of security awareness people. I want to start actually using that talk track, and I'll actually share the deck. I'd love to get your feedback. But I think it's really about teaching people how to build stories. It's a human thing, and for whatever reason, technical people feel like, oh, I can't do that. You can. It takes practice and work. But I didn't start out being this. You didn't start out being you. We learned this. And how did we learn it? We failed. We got yelled at. We didn't get what we wanted, but we learned from that. And that's the key thing, is how do we learn from what we're talking about and what we're hearing? And, oh, that did not work. Why? And then getting better over time. People call me an expert, and thankfully you did not. I hate that term. I'm an experienced practitioner. All that means is I've made a ton of mistakes, and hopefully I can help you not make those mistakes. You may make other ones, but hopefully you won't make the same ones I did. I think it's very
Sure.
much like parenting, right?
Sure.
I'm going to mess my kids up. I'm just going to do it differently than my parents messed me up.
Sure, absolutely. So I want to jump back on one particular point. It deals with the board of directors. The CISO, not in all cases, I know exceptions to this, but a lot of times you have 15 minutes to talk to the board. You don't have a chance to even communicate with them. You're getting authorized of what to tell, especially if you're reporting into a technical function. It goes to the technical, sometimes it goes to audit, sometimes it goes to COO, then CEO, then the board. Yep. And by the time you have that, you get this watered down set of KPIs, things that you want to talk about. It's a big problem in cybersecurity, but if you've got 15 minutes to present something, how do you present something when you've got a lot of guardrails on things that you're going to be saying, because it might interfere with some others? Because, hey, I've got an interest in saying, look, I got 90% of my patching done, and really they got 60%, or maybe they got 90% of the Windows patches, but the Linux, not so good. Whatever the story might happen to be.
That is a very challenging question. When I was an analyst, I reviewed probably 500 or 600 board decks, and frequently I would go to the CISO and go, yeah, this is not going to work, and here's why, and here's what you need. And he would say, yeah, the CIO is not going to let me say that. So I think that what we need to be mindful of is leading them to ask better questions. And one of the things that I have a set of 18 questions that I actually give board members. I'm saying, here's what you should be asking your CISO. So I think there are three things you want to get out there. One is, we know what you do for a living. We understand the business goals and objectives. That needs to be in your deck, whether it's a graphic from the website, whether it's a table of the objectives from your annual report, but whatever. But you need to articulate to them that and what I get from CISOs on that, and I bet you hear the same thing, they know what their objectives are. That is correct, but they don't know that you know. So you have to tell them. The second thing is, here are the top no more than 5 to 7 risks to you achieving those goals that we want to talk about. And the reason why 5 to 7, you and I talked about psychology. Human brains can only maintain 7 pieces of information in their head at any one time. There's a thing called the rule of 5 plus or minus 2, which basically says anything less than 3, people don't think it's important. Anything more than 7, they can't remember. And if you combine that with the concepts of primacy and recency, which is people remember the first thing you told them and the last thing you told them, they forget everything in the middle. So 5 to 7, the 5 is actually ideal. And then tell them, here are the 3 again, 5 to 7, 3 to 5 is better. Strategic program initiatives we have, not patching, right? System protection, identity and access management, right? So these high level things. And I think this is where NIST CSF actually has some great framing. And I have some work that I've done where I took all the 5 levels. Well, now it's 6 because they had governance finally. Well, pulled governance out and gave it its own thing. But what is governance? What is identify? Like, what do these things mean from a business perspective? Know what we're doing, right? Know what our risks are. So those are the 3 things I think that are important. And then once you get them to buy into that, then you can start talking about metrics and measures and KPIs and KRIs. And I think, and it's very much a balance beam, because you definitely, a lot of CISOs, especially the ones that report to the CIOs or CTOs, they're in a bad position because their job in part is to talk about how their bosses are not doing their jobs right. So
Yeah.
it's really hard. And I know these are very sort of high level abstractions. I have found that more than anything else I've spoken to people about in the last 30 years, board reporting is the one that requires the most customization and the most hand holding. And I will tell you, Matthew, I've reviewed board decks from the same CISO multiple times, and they're just not doing what we're telling them to do. They're not embedding that. They just keep giving the same stuff. And unfortunately, boards are not necessarily seeing better stuff, so they don't know that there are better ways. I was at an event in Anaheim for the Private Directors Association, and I had the opportunity to present to a few dozen board members. Here's what you should be asking your CISOs. Here's what you should be seeing. Here's what you should be learning. Before I start, I asked them all a question. How many of you understand why your security team does what they do? And not one hand went up. That is a failure on us to communicate why what we do is important to them. What is in it for them? What have you done for me lately? And we don't
Yeah.
do a great job of that. And I think that's why we need more people like you and I who are having these conversations and educating people. And I know you run a lot of great workshops on here's the stuff we need to do and here's how you do it. There's a lot of, well, we need to talk more about here's how we can. And I think some of that requires more face-to-face. So that's why I love the stuff that you are working on at Cybergence.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, those are definitely some huge challenges. And I knew I was asking a very sticky, thorny question. So I really
That's
appreciate
okay.
you
I'm good with that.
taking the time to dive into those, because I think, a lot of times I'm going to call them impertinent questions, are the most important questions that you need to ask when stepping into an organization. If you don't ask them, you're never going to know, and that's something too, because part of the challenge that I see out there is quite often executives are afraid to ask questions, or sometimes they don't want to know. I've seen it where just flat out, don't tell me, that's your problem, not mine. But the other thing is there's also reticence because they don't know how to communicate. Executives don't know how to communicate with IT, like giving people the tools to understand even how to create business alignment is a very important skill that an executive needs. But I've also found both on the CISO side and the CTO and the CIO side at certain points, depending on the person, they look at that, oh, that's some weird business thing, when it's a great tool that absolutely anybody could use. And that's some of the challenges, because when you go back, there's this great report that was out talking about education, and cybersecurity really wasn't there even back in 2016. Barely any companies or any schools that were out there required any training. So who are the CEOs and the CIOs and stuff like that, and the up and coming people within organizations? We didn't learn anything. We didn't learn about business alignment. We didn't learn about how to use these tools in a different manner. And I think, you get that up to the board level. They're starting to get into their 60s and 70s. They haven't been trained on those quite often as well. I know some exceptions. This is not 100% true, but it's a big challenge that I think everybody needs to work through. This is not just a cybersecurity issue. This is a business issue.
And part of the thing too, so you just hit on something really interesting. So I just learned that they just raised the mandatory retirement age for board members for publicly traded companies, which means we're going to start seeing more of the older people. And I think that's to our detriment. But I actually you hit on something really interesting in education. So I had a conversation with a very, very bright young lady. She just started a master's program in cybersecurity at a very well-known, prestigious university. I won't name because I don't want to call people out. He told me she is not allowed without special dispensation to take classes in the business school. And I literally lost my shit.
Wow.
Pardon my French.
To
And
me, that's where they need to. They need to learn those kind of skills early.
She said, "What do you mean?" I go, well, "I'm not mad at you. I don't understand how that's a thing in a big prestigious private university that they're not allowing you. And you could do it, but you have to get permission." And their answer was really, "We don't want you technical people in our business classes," was really the answer. And I'm like, that is horrendous. And I don't know if you've looked at a lot of the programs out there. I think a lot of the cybersecurity programs, and I'm actually calling out all of our university brethren, sistren, you guys need to build a CISO level educational program that isn't about technology. It's got to be about bringing all that stuff together. Risk is a business discipline. We've been managing risk for decades, centuries even. there's still not this synergy. And I've looked at a lot of these programs. They're either really high level fluffy or they're very, very technical. And I don't see anything sort of in the middle. So if anyone listening out there knows of any programs that bring that together, please let us know. And I will say nice things about that. Well, you do it.
I'm teaching it. I teach the
Yeah.
financial skills. I teach the business skills. I teach all of those sorts of things.
But
I'm
you're
doing.
one person and there's a scaling issue there,
Yeah,
right?
there
We need
is.
the universities to get on board with that approach.
Yeah,
And
because I'm going to say a little bit about my background as well. I think you may or may not be aware. My undergraduate degree is called Philosophy of Social Theory, Integrating Political Science and Economics. It's because I like to dance everywhere.
yep,
And that's part of, what drove me building Cyvergence is because I've got this outside perspective. I look at things from 100 different angles. I don't look at things purely within the tech, purely within the cyber, but I think that it's in addition to the way I approach the world, I've got this always learning mindset that's allowed me to have a completely different view on things because you talked a little bit about the discipline and education and where things are coming from. I think that's a big challenge right there, that they aren't letting this person learn some of the business skills. And that's exactly what you need. You need some cross pollination. You need more people like me to educate people and get people to understand where those challenges are. Because if you don't understand the business, you're going to be stuck talking tech, and then the tech people can't talk to the business, and you're just
right.
compounding the overall problem. I respect the business skills. I think they're absolutely critical. But I
Yeah.
also think there are other skills that are out there as well that you need a lot of people that are sort of in between. A good CISO, I would argue, needs to step into multiple worlds. They can't just step into, especially when you talk about, unless you're dealing with the three lines model and some of the larger companies, there's all kinds of different management models that are in place. But for a lot of these small and medium businesses, the CISO needs to be able to speak business as well as some of the others. And I think that's one of the big challenges. It sounds like you feel the same way. I'm just very passionate
Yeah,
about it right
this
now.
is this is this is why you and I get along so well because I'm a big believer in always learning. My dad taught me a lesson a long time ago. He said, "Any day you do not learn something new is a waste of a day." And I live my life by that
Yes.
premise, right? I have a certificate in marketing management that I got, on my own time. I do a ton of reading and I do struggle sometimes with business books. I feel like they write a 200-page book and really they could make their point in 20 pages, but that's a different challenge altogether. But I agree. I think we need to do that. And you know what's missing, Matthew? You and I think I'm a little bit older than you, but when we were coming up, all these big companies had management trainee programs where they brought these people in and they gave them 4 to 6 weeks in every bit. You're going to go spend 6 weeks in sales. You're going to spend 6 weeks in marketing, 6 weeks in R&D. We don't do that anymore. And I think we need to do that for cybersecurity people. I feel the military, I think, has a great model for that, right? When you get to a certain point in your promotion, they force you to look at other disciplines within the military ecosystem. We need to do that. You want to get above a manager level, you need to go and we'll help you with it. And of course, this is a big company thing, right? Mom and pop shops, aren't going to be able to do this, but for bigger companies, and I'm not talking about $50 billion companies, I'm talking about companies up into the, high hundreds of millions
Sure.
of dollars, I think can absolutely do something. Maybe you don't do 6 weeks, maybe you do a week, but learning what the business does and what they care about and learning their language is a huge thing. And people are just not doing it. And it's this constant battle about whether CISO should be technical or not. And, I think you and I are on the
Yeah.
same page. And I still see people come out and go, well, the CISO knows this. I go, let me tell you something. I've been doing this for 35 years. I have no idea what you just said. And it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. And it's just, I'm very passionate about it.
Even back in my school days, I'd learn about some disciplines and you'd have all these experts, but they've got their own language that they developed around their
Right.
analysis, and they can't understand what somebody else in the same area is doing because they've got a completely different language that they're focusing on. And we've got the same thing within businesses. And one of the challenges too, and I think this is something that a lot of businesses run into, is that communication issue. It also gets down, there's something more fundamental to mentorship and coaching are missing because a lot of IT people are squeezed. I like to use the Boeing example, which I've used many times, where it's like, hey, you've got to move, and everything's faster and faster and faster. I was talking to somebody just a couple weeks ago, and he was in a situation where it's like, nope, you've got 5 days, give me feedback. If not, your security review doesn't matter because we're going to move full
Right.
speed ahead and everything is faster, faster, faster. How do we do that? We should throw in more AI. What we're doing is we're throwing in more and more slop in there, but we're not taking the time to really mentor and get to know people. But what they found for the companies that really invest the time and the effort into it, that they get dividend returns on this. There are massive returns on that. Companies can scale better, they learn better, and it gets back to just basic group dynamics. And it's something that a lot of people are not necessarily focused on. So you're hitting on a lot of my like pain points for me personally that I enjoy, but I do think that you can communicate better when you understand their language, you understand who they
Right.
are, you understand what they care about. You now know how to communicate with them and speak their language. And it's just something that I think is missing from a lot of different organizations. And I think sometimes kind of pull it back to KPIs. Some of those KPIs I think could be very, very valuable because they can start to get to know you, they respect you based on where you're at. And I think those are very important skills because then they
Right.
start to
People
see you as
don't
a human
always know
being.
what other people do, right? What do you
Yeah,
do day to day? And it's interesting because my wife has her own company. She does resume writing and career coaching for really senior people.
sure.
And she has an amazing skill where she can talk to people in a very technical discipline and actually turn that into an amazing sort of marketing piece, right? To help people find a new job. But she has a skill that most people don't have, which is she can take that and she knows what to not care about from a very deeply technical perspective. And frequently she'll hang up and go, I don't even know what that guy was talking about. And then she will turn that into an amazing piece of marketing documentation, right? So that I think it's funny because I think we all have skills and we just assume other people can do those things and really they can't. So, and again, to your point, talking about KPIs, that's why I'm a big fan of, does this help you make better decisions? Ask people that. Do you not want to hear about this anymore? And maybe they're going to tell you, I don't know what that is. Well, let me tell you why I think it might be useful. And if you still don't think it is, I will never, ever talk to you about that again. And I think we also tend to fall in love with our metrics. And I think that's something we need to sort of move
Yeah.
away from. Some metrics, especially like project level metrics, have a limited lifespan. You want to report on the status of a project,
Hear
great.
about it
But when
in
you
the
get to
project.
95%, yeah, 95.2% doesn't really mean all of that.
That's a good
It doesn't
pivoting
mean that much.
point because the KPIs, they're going to matter in some contexts, but not others. We
Right.
talked a little bit about high trust. I know somebody's got roughly 1,200 controls that they're following, and every single one of those is a key performance indicator. To me, there starts to get to a point where it's going to be a little bit overboard in terms of those key performance indicators. It's not really a key performance indicator. You never want to present that up to a board of directors, 1,200 different controls. It's a little bit on the crazy side of the house. It's too much for most people to
Yeah.
process or work with or understand. And you're getting into geek speak when you get into that many level controls. And think of it for those who are not familiar with what controls are, think of them as a requirement from a cybersecurity perspective, something that has to get done, like a
Right.
firewall review, things like that. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that and learning that communication and who to communicate with. Where do you use something like those KPIs within a framework like high trust that does require them versus other frameworks? And what's important, what doesn't work from your perspective?
I think when we talk about controls, I think it's really important to understand. So, what's the underlying risk, right? Why, like these controls, that people don't pull them out of the air. They put a control in because it addresses some underlying risk. And I think we need to figure out, and I'm not a high trust expert, but I'm assuming all the controls are sort of bundled into groupings.
Yes.
I think that's really what we need to report on is the groupings. And then if someone says, well, why is that 50% versus 80, or why is it a 2 versus a 5, then we can start to kind of do a deeper dive. But we need to start down there. I'll give you a little bit of a silly example. So there's a series of books that I love, Dungeon Crawler Carl, and it's lit RPG. And when the character first starts, he looks at his interface. He's got thousands of skills, but some of the skills are shoe tying, right? You know what? You don't ever need to talk about that. So he's able to flip a switch in his interface, which goes from thousands down to hundreds. And then you can flip it further, and then it gets down to stuff that's really important, like punching monsters in the head. That's that level of abstraction that we need to go to. And I did some research a bunch of years ago on kind of 3 tiers of metrics. So we had operational metrics, which are good for the technical people. That's the 1,200, right? We then have what I called sort of project level metrics, which are, okay, so let's bundle those 1,200 maybe into 100 different groupings. And then you have the management metrics, which are the program level, which are the top 6 or 8 levels. And depending on to whom you're speaking, you may want to break those down. And I think that's the key thing. And you need to know, like, is it appropriate to go a level down? And sometimes you say, that's a great question. I feel like it's probably not appropriate for this audience. I'm happy to sit down with you and go through the whole control catalog whenever you want, but let's move on and really talk about things. And that's, we talked about board presentation. And I think sometimes as a presenter, you need to control the narrative. If they ask you, well, what does that vulnerability scanning thing mean? That's a great question. I don't know that it's relevant to this conversation. I don't think it's going to help us make better decisions, right? Us, not you or me, us. Happy to have that conversation, but why don't we move to this level here? And you can do that. And I've seen it and I've coached people on it hundreds of times. It works.
Yeah.
And we need to do that. So I think to come back to the question, will the person care and why? And then what do we want them to do? And I think that helps you drive what KPIs and what controls and what sort of programmatic things sort of, need to go out. And actually, I saw an interesting post on LinkedIn. Somebody was talking about process maturity metrics. And I went, I don't think CISOs are really doing that anymore. I haven't really seen it in a while, and I think there's some value to process, right? Scalable, repeatable behavioral patterns. Given the same set of inputs, do we have the same response? But I feel like that process maturity for cybersecurity and risk management has sort of come and gone to a certain extent. I feel like we need to move, again, to your point about how does this impact our risk posture? In other words, how does it impact achieving our business goals and objectives? And I'll be honest with you, I don't see how going from a 2.8 to a 3 in, CMMI for security, whatever they call it, is a useful conversation. You may see it differently, and maybe I'm just not talking to the right CISOs. But a friend of mine posted, he's like, I don't think you're talking to the same CISOs I talk to. And I think that's the thing. And that just shows the change, right? Because 10 years ago, process maturity was huge. And I created a tool at Gartner to actually manage that. I'm not really seeing that as a discussion topic anymore. And I think probably good.
It's actually much more common. I mean, I work with a lot of different types of companies, and it's still very much used today. They don't fully understand it, from the business standpoint. But I think that's, to your point, I think that's one of the challenges that you have. But the question should be, and you've been saying this multiple times today, and it really resonates with me, it's how do you make a decision? But the challenge is a lot of times when you look at the metrics and you take a look at some of the frameworks that are out there, they all are going to be based on that. You take a look at high trust. What is that? Well, they want to see KPIs when you get up to a certain level. And so that's a big challenge. And even when you look at NIST CSF, the one thing that I find that a lot of people missed out in NIST CSF is their maturity rating, because they go 1 to 4. It isn't 0 to 5, it's 1 to 4. And it's how integrated is your decision-making process. And to me, that's very critical. It's a very critical thing because you've got to integrate cybersecurity into the decision-making process, just like you would anything else. But the challenge is when you work with a lot of auditors, they're so used to, well, the framework says, and they're looking at their little beans and things like that, trying to make sure this stuff is done. They're looking at things differently. And that's where I think there's a lot of challenges within organizations, is trying to get to that decision level. But it's a whole different thing, because you've got the whole frameworks and all the cyber stuff and how are we protecting things? Did we block this? Do we prevent this email coming through that's malicious? All those kind of things. But then how is that really going to impact a mission critical objective? And one of the interesting things, and it's kind of ironic, and you had brought this up, a lot of CISOs aren't necessarily paying attention to the operational metrics, which I found that to be true in some cases and not others, because I'm seeing a lot of experimentation going on with this cybersecurity role right now. But the business people, when you're talking to them, they tend to respond to operational information much more than cyber. Because they care about it. Oh, what happens if this goes down? Which gets into the critical objectives, and then you can get into those what if discussions.
What's interesting about that, though, is operational impact and operational metrics are very, very
not always
different.
The same.
Yeah, and I think that's the important thing. And I'm a big fan of sort of resilience as a driver, right? How do we keep the business at a minimum level of viability no matter what happens? That to me is operations. And this is something that we've been doing a lot of at Black Kite, which is, listen, your vendors, your partners, your third parties, they have your data. And would it be bad if they lost your data? It wouldn't be good. But really, it is much more important to talk about the business impact if they can't give you the product or service you pay them for. And that's
Sure.
that operational impact. And people are still not having those conversations enough. They're still talking very much about the data. And I have news for all the people out there. Your data is out there. It's just out, it's out there already. If you look at the number of records that have been breached, every single person in the world that has a credit card, your credit card's out there. Your
Yeah.
social security number, your national ID, your health, all that stuff is out there. It's in a big giant morass of issues. And this is where I think AI is going to be dangerous, because I think people can turn AI loose on that and actually build profiles that will potentially lead to different damage. But that's probably a topic for a follow-up. But I do, again, I come back to the same sort of question is, does this help you make better decisions? And can you articulate why you made those decisions? I'm a big fan of the concept of defensibility, which is we accepted that risk because it aligns with our risk appetite. Knowing what we know now, because the environment changes, we would continue to accept that risk, or we would not. And here's the plan to not, to treat that and mitigate that. And, we have a lot of transactional conversations, but these are longer term things. I was talking with a buddy of mine at an event out in Colorado 2 weeks ago. He said, look, he was a CISO. Now he works for a vendor. He talks to salespeople, and the salespeople are like, oh, compliance. He goes, no. He said, here's the thing. If I'm in a big company like a big bank and the auditors find something, I could easily push them out 3 years before anything really bad happens. Here's the plan. We're going to talk about it. We got meetings. We're going to actually address it. And they recognize you can't just do a forklift replacement of a process. So compliance, I think, gets conversations going, but we need to be careful about that being the only driver. And one of the things that we need to be careful, and I know you and I agree about this, we've seen there's now an abstraction. Frequently, the risk is actually about being found not compliant rather than the risk of the underlying problem, which is you can't do your stuff, you can't maintain your data. And that is a problem that we need to figure out. And unfortunately, I think the barn door maybe have left open, and I don't know that we're going to be able to close it. But
It's a
we need,
really tough
again, we
thing
need to have more
too.
business aligned conversations.
Yeah, and it's a really tough thing too, because people could say, "Oh, SOC 2," and it's easy word without having to explain all the intricacies of what cybersecurity is. When you look
Right.
at a lot of the board information that's out there, and this is starting to change. This is not 100% true. I know exceptions, but for the most part, they're afraid to ask the right questions. They don't want to look
Mhm.
stupid, but they can ask, "Well, how are we on the SOC 2?" Oh, okay, that's where we're at. Okay, and
Right.
then you get things that are very nuanced in there, and that becomes a
Right.
big challenge for them to understand, especially if they don't come from a cyber or an IT background. And then you compound that problem with CISOs that are not necessarily communicating in a friendly way. It creates some communication challenges. At least that's been my experience. How have you been able to get
Well,
beyond
not
that?
not every
No,
not
not
every SOC
everybody.
2 is the
Not everybody.
same, right?
I
Not
know.
every
I
SOC
know.
2 is the same. There are 5 different areas, and not all of them are covered
Yep.
all the
Yep.
time. And depending on who's doing it, and whether they had their coffee, like they're to your point, it's a lot of it is somewhat subjective, or yeah,
Some of it.
subjective,
Some of it.
and
Some of it is. Yeah.
yeah, and I think to your point, it's not the be all the end all. I remember when cloud was still fairly new, we would tell people, well, you got to ask your SaaS provider for some justification that they're doing good security. And you know what they were doing is a lot of times they were giving you SOC 2, and when you asked them, it was Amazon SOC 2, or if it was Microsoft SOC 2, or Rackspace's SOC 2. And okay, well, that's great. I know what they're doing, but what are you doing on your application? And now that's people have figured that
Oh,
out.
yeah.
But I think that's the kind of nuance, and we're seeing it now around AI too, right? AI governance is a big hot topic. I think a lot of organizations have AI governance in place that they're not actually doing anything with. Yes, we have it, and then that's it, right? But I think coming back to your question is, I think we need to, again, coming back to what we keep saying it over and over and over again. What are your business goals and objectives? What are you trying to accomplish? Are the findings in the SOC 2 align with that? And here's just a caveat, and I'm sure you will agree. If a SOC 2 has no findings, that's scarier to me than one that has 50 findings. right? Because I don't care who you are, no organization is perfect. And there should be findings in every single SOC 2. The problem is sometimes they get buried and people are using AI to parse them, and we do that. But I think we have to be mindful that some of this stuff is not deterministic. And we need to figure out, you got to run it through a couple of times before you decide, yes, we're comfortable with this. And then if there's a finding, what does that finding mean for me, right? If you don't have any of my PII or my NPPI or any of my financial data, I don't necessarily care as much that you have findings than if you do have that data. And that nuance in that context is not built in, right? The SOC 2 is based on the provider. It's not based on the consumer, and every consumer is consuming that in different ways.
Sure. So we've covered a lot of ground today. So thank you very much. I've been a little more passionate than I was expecting to be, but you kind of end up drawing that out of me, whether you mean to or not.
Good. I love it. I love it. I love that.
So,
I love that interaction. It's fun.
and I love the spirit that you brought in, sir. So if we were to kind of distill it down to some final advice for CISOs, what would you recommend to CISOs? What do you recommend when you're on that KPI journey? What would be the top, say, 3 things that you would want to help them with or leave them with today?
All right. So number one is talk to people that don't do what you do for a living, right? We talked about it, learning about different disciplines, understanding what people are doing. Take your colleagues out for cocktails and go, so, well, like, what do you do, right? People are good in cocktails, or you could bring in donuts. The second thing would be question everything you're sharing. Why are we sharing this? What do we want them to take away from it? Ask them, is this useful? Does this help you make better decisions? Does this help you understand better what we do and why we do it? So asking those questions. And then I think the third one is recognizing that in large organizations, recognize that the CISO function is largely an ombuds function. It's a communication conduit between the technical side of the house and the business side of the house. And I think we need to bring those people together. And I think we need more people who can do what you and I do, which is take the business discipline, take the technology. You don't have to be an expert in both, but be able to bring that together. And then I think the final takeaway, and we've talked about this quite a bit, is learn how to build these narratives, learn how to be a storyteller. And you don't have to be a Stephen King to do that, right? Some of these stories are really very simple. We do this thing in this way at this level in order to manage this risk so that you can achieve your goal and objective. And here's an example of how that would work. And I think that's it. It's not rocket science. It's literally embedded in human culture and DNA to tell stories. If you look at the cave paintings in France, those are stories about why we should hunt together and not alone. And those are kind of my takeaways.
I love it. Thank you so much. I've had a
Oh
lot
my
of
God,
fun
it was my
having the
pleasure,
discussion
Matthew.
today. This was fantastic. You're full of a lot of great ideas. Your experience really shines through, and I thought you brought a lot to the table. So I want to thank you very much for your time today.
Yep, I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate you, Matthew, as a friend and colleague.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.